The young and the restless spoilers. Now that Cain had firmly re-established himself in Genoa City, his presence was impossible to ignore, and, for many, impossible to tolerate. His return was not a quiet one, not the subdued re-entry of a man seeking redemption or reconciliation. Instead, it was deliberate, calculated, and openly ambitious. He had purchased prime real estate, moving quickly to secure both a personal base of operations and a series of holdings that could serve as the foundation for a much larger play. Every move he made seemed to fit into a broader design, one aimed squarely at dominance, not just in business but in influence, in the shaping of the city's future. Cain's ambition was a living thing, and it was beginning to breathe heavily down the necks of everyone who thought their position in Genoa City was secure. In doing so, he had managed, almost effortlessly, to position himself as the city's public enemy number one. The list of people who resented him stretched far beyond the usual corporate rivals or former lovers scorned. It included those who saw his schemes as a direct threat to the fragile balance of alliances that kept Genoa City's powerful families from tearing each other apart completely. Every handshake he offered was suspected of hiding a blade. Every smile carried the weight of ulterior motives. The atmosphere around him was thick with distrust, and in a town where grudges were currency, that made him a man marked for more than just boardroom defeats. The storyline in Nice had been a sharp, tightly wound detective tale, a web of lies, shifting alliances, and lethal consequences, and while that chapter had closed, the undercurrent it left behind had not dissipated. If anything, it had followed Cain back across the ocean, trailing him like a shadow. Genoa City had its own appetite for danger, and there was no reason the game couldn't shift from the French Riviera to the streets and penthouses of his home turf. In fact, for those who had suffered or lost because of him, the return of Cain to familiar ground might have been seen as an invitation. There were plenty with motives to want him gone. The families he had crossed, the allies he had betrayed, the lovers he had wounded, each one carried a story of why Cain's downfall would be a cause for celebration. It didn't take much imagination to envision the show framing a storyline around an attempted assassination. The classic Who Shot Cain? Setup was almost too tempting to resist. It would be a storyline rich in suspects, each with their own reasons, their own secret alibis, and their own limits to how far they'd go to see him erased from the equation. And yet, for all the danger swirling around him, there was the undeniable reality that Cain was not going anywhere. The actor behind him, fresh to the role, had been brought in with the clear intention of shaping him into a long-term player in the Genoa City arena. That meant that no matter how tense the storyline became, no matter how close the crosshairs might seem, Cain's fate was not to be written off in a quick blaze of gunfire. But survival did not mean safety. If anything, the inevitability of his survival only added another layer of intrigue. An attempted assassination could still carry devastating consequences without ending his run entirely. A single bullet, even one that missed its mark, could leave behind wounds that cut deeper than flesh. Wounds to his mobility, his confidence, or his grip on power. A carefully timed attack could shatter alliances, throw his plans into disarray, and force him into a defensive posture for the first time since his return. It could send shockwaves through every storyline he touched, making friends question their loyalty and enemies reconsider their strategies. For Cain, the threat was real, even if the outcome was predetermined. To be targeted in Genoa City was not simply a matter of dodging a bullet or surviving an ambush, it was about the ripple effect that followed. His empire, still in its formative stages, could be undermined by the mere perception of vulnerability. The predators circling him would see blood in the water, and they would not hesitate to close in. Whether the attack came in the form of a sniper's shot in the night, a poisoned drink at an elite gala, or a staged accident designed to look like bad luck, the danger would leave its mark. And Cain, for all his poise and careful planning, knew that the moment someone made a move on his life, the game would change forever. The question was not whether someone would try, it was who, and how, and what they would be willing to risk to see it done. Now that Genoa City had absorbed the shock of Cain's return and the sharper shock of his unapologetic ambition, the city's pulse seemed to rearrange itself around him, each beat a calculation, each breath a wager. Until the night the shot cracked through the damp air behind the glass of the riverfront plaza and sent him staggering into a shower of light and sirens, the bullet carving heat along his ribs before burying itself in the concrete planter at his back, a near miss that became, by morning, a moral referendum, a political weapon, a family trial, and the opening move in a meticulously engineered mystery that threatened to devour every alliance left standing. For even as Cain gritted his teeth through the bandage change and ordered his acquisitions team to proceed with deeds and transfers that would consolidate his new holdings, the conversation in every boardroom, kitchen, and shadowed penthouse had already shifted to the only question that mattered. Who had pulled the trigger, and why? And there were too many answers for comfort, too many names with reasons sharp enough to cut, beginning with Lily Winters, whose grief had been forced to live in the same house as her anger for far too long, whose fury had been sharpened further by the revelations from Nice, by the trip that had not been a trip, by the lies that had not been mistakes but deliberate scaffolding built around her to carry her into danger, and by the whispered calculus that Devon could not help voicing when he admitted that, in the flash when Carter aimed cold metal at Lily's life, Cain had seemed ready to barter breath for breath if it bought him one more step of advantage, and so it was not surprising that the gossip engines sputtered first to life with Lily's name. Because the human mind searches for symmetry and neither the existence of love nor the ghost of marriage nor the shared weight of raising twins can counterbalance the arithmetic of betrayal forever, but rumor is a blunt instrument and reality is a finer needle, and the detectives, official and uninvited, who began stitching together the evening's timeline discovered a pattern built in misdirection, a choreography of lights gone out and cameras looping, a convenient maintenance outage at precisely the moment the bullet flew, a valet ledger rewritten in a hand that almost matched the original, and a grainy image of a dark coat moving against the river's reflection that someone swore was Lily and someone else swore was not, while Lily herself refused to perform innocence or guilt on demand, choosing instead to stand still in the hurricane of accusation and memory, because in her bones she knew that whoever had placed her at the edge of this narrative wanted her to break and would need to find another tool if she would not. Holden Novak occupied the next ring of suspicion, his name drawn into the circle not merely by proximity to Cain's schemes but by the iron filings of motive that rushed toward him whenever the late Damien Cain was mentioned, for it was whispered that Holden had carried bitterness like a hidden blade since the final night in France, that whatever had happened in the corridors and terraces of Nice had torn something essential out of him, and that his loyalty to Cain was a contract with more subtext than ink, a ledger of favors and debts and grief with no clean entries. He was the unseen apparatus behind too many of Cain's moves, the quiet architect of shell companies and the courier of signatures, and yet he had also been the only one who was recorded entering a private garage 15 minutes before the shot and emerging 5 after with a coat slightly darker than the one he had worn in, an optical trick perhaps, a trick of wet pavement perhaps, and perhaps nothing at all, but to those who craved a straight line from motive to act, it was a line that could be sketched with minimal imagination, particularly if one accepted the theory that Holden blamed Cain for Damien's death, that beneath the veneer of collaboration simmered a ledger-demanding balance, and that the most poetic balance, in some minds, is simply an ending that echoes an ending. And yet Holden's alibi, delivered without flourish, was stubborn, an invoice dispute with a contractor across town corroborated by timestamps and an irritated project manager, the sort of gray, inelegant truth that makes for terrible television and excellent acquittals, and so his name hovered, neither cleared nor condemned, a storm cell that might break or dissolve depending on winds no one could quite read. Amy Lewis entered the suspect gallery like a match struck in a closed room, her story one of those private epics that people think they understand because they can list the headlines, grief, illness, isolation, hope weaponized and hope withdrawn, but which no one fully comprehends unless they have breathed it themselves. If Cain's maneuvers had intersected with the path of Damien, if that intersection had ended in a ghost and not a reconciliation, then the argument that Amy could be pushed to the edge did not feel like gossip so much as a grim litany. And it is tragic arithmetic that a person who has been stripped of safety learns quickly how to strip safety from others. But Amy's movements that night were an unhelpful blend of erratic and accounted for, a hospital corridor here and a pharmacy window there, a rideshare that took a wrong turn and a neighbor's doorbell camera that caught her staring into middle distance as if memory had tripped her feet, the chaotic choreography of a person whose life had lost its rhythm long before the bullet found its air. And if one wanted to believe her innocent one could, and if one wished to paint her corner with darker pigment, there was enough smear available for the brush. The Newmans and the Abbotts did not need invitation to be implicated. Their names arrive unbidden at any scene in Genoa City where power exchanges hands under duress, where money chooses a new direction, where an old alliance is made to kneel, and Cain's momentum had made him an irritant in both dynasties' eyes before he became a threat, and a threat before he became a public target, and it was a simple exercise of imagination to assign motive to nearly any of them. Victor could be accused of trying to prune a dangerous vine before it wound around the foundations of Newman Enterprises. Nick could be accused of moving to neutralize chaos before it touched the few fragile things he still defended without apology. Victoria could be accused of preempting a harvest of trouble in her division by cutting a single stalk, while on the Abbott side Jack's protectiveness of Jabot could be recast into ruthlessness by a single camera angle and Billy's complicated alliance with Cain into a double game at last unmasked. But to weave any of these suspicions into proof required threads that refused to lie flat, for wherever the investigation turned it found a counterweight, an offsetting detail, a reminder that the Newmans and Abbotts play 10 moves ahead and seldom leave their fingerprints on the first move, and so the chorus of accusation became a hum, and the hum became a pressure system, and the pressure system settled over the city with the storm's patience. Cain himself watched the forming storm with a predator's stillness, acknowledging with a small, private humor that his insistence on becoming the central axis of Genoa City's economy had made him the central axis of its mythology as well. He had spoken often since Nice of a faceless hunter, of the sense that a mechanism had been set in motion on the other side of the ocean and allowed to follow him home, something more disciplined than vengeance and more personal than competition. And the night of the shot confirmed that the thing shadowing him had no intention of letting geography dull its edge, yet Cain's response was not retreat but escalation, a decision to answer precision with precision, to turn his new portfolio into a fortress, to purchase silence where necessary and loyalty were available, to hire specialists who knew how to read burned metadata and repaired drywall, to smuggle truth out from beneath the noise, and to keep the arabesque endgame alive even as his blood-stained gauze and his lawyers rehearsed phrasing for statements that would say nothing and suggest everything, because a man who surrenders momentum in Genoa City seldom recovers it, and Cain had built his new life on the premise that momentum, once acquired, must be shepherded through every crisis like an heirloom that cannot be replaced. But the city has a way of insisting on its own narratives, and in the days that followed the shot, Genoa City began to tell the story it wanted to hear. That Lily Winters had raised her arm because love and anger are not opposites but neighbors, that Holden Novak had choreographed the moment as a ledger entry in a book of grief, that Amy Lewis had crossed a line between mourning and justice, that Victor had once more decided which pieces could be sacrificed, that Jack had once more decided which lines could be crossed for family, that Billy had played both sides until the sides played him, that Phyllis had inserted herself into the stairwell of fate because quiet is not a language she speaks, and that Cain, who had wanted to own the city's future, now found himself reduced to a man trying to survive its present, yet beneath the clamor, quieter truths struggled for air. A maintenance request filed 3 days early by a contractor whose phone number belonged to no one, a security camera whose buffer skipped only during a meteorological window that did not exist, an access badge used at a door that had been sealed for a year, a bouquet delivered to Amy that carried a florist's code known to Holden's courier, a rideshare route whose detour matched the path of a shuttered traffic sensor, and a recurring symbol carved into the underpanel of the planter where the bullet spent its last motion, a symbol that Lily had once doodled in the margin of a notebook and that, more chillingly, had appeared in the corner of a photo from Nice that no one remembered taking. It was as if the past had agreed to collaborate with the present to write a palimpsest of guilt across the surface of the city, and the investigating minds who were not blinded by urgency began to wonder whether the crime was a single act or an aggregate, a collage cut from many hands and then rearranged, purposefully or by chance, into a picture that pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. Phyllis Summers, who had been told, perhaps truthfully and perhaps not, that Billy was not part of Cain's real plan, used the chaos the way a dancer uses music, slipping between factions to collect fragments and confidences, taking advantage of the fact that shock loosens tongues and pain seeks audience, and what she gathered was a theory that no one wanted to name. That the shooter had been selected not for their motive but for their plausibility, that someone with a higher vantage had orchestrated the evening so that Lily's path and Amy's detour and Holden's invoice dispute and the Newmans' closed-door meeting and the Abbotts' after-hours strategy session all produced a spirograph of suspicion unforgettable, enough to last a full sweep cycle while Arabesque's legal scaffolding locked into place unnoticed, that the true target was less Cain's body than Cain's ability to act freely, because a man cast as Corey cannot also be the hunter, and if you needed him alive for the next phase but constrained, frightened, forced into reaction, an almost fatal shot was not just theater but engineering. And if that was the truth, then the list of suspects was both larger and smaller than the city imagined, larger because anyone with access to money and systems could have commissioned the choreography, smaller because only a handful of minds in Genoa City marry patience to ruthlessness with such easy consistency. Meanwhile Billy, stung by the suggestion that he was a pawn in Cain's design and equally stung by the insinuation that he might be playing his family false, doubled down on his own investigation, reconnecting with informants who owed him favors from years when his name carried different dangers, following the trail of a shell company that owned a building 2 doors from the shooting site and that, 5 weeks earlier, had rented a suite to a film collective that owned no cameras, a collective whose incorporated members were an invented man with an invented address and a dissolved charity with a name close enough to a real one to pass a casual audit, a collective that vacated its lease the day after the shot and left no prints, no hair, no coffee rings, nothing but a taped rectangle on the carpet where a case had rested and a smear of adhesive on the balcony rail that matched adhesive on clamps used to secure long lenses, and when Billy followed the money backwards, it dissolved into a trust with a trustee in Zurich and a silent partner whose signature, when magnified, carried an intentional tremor that he recognized from another document on another continent filed during the final week in Nice, a week when people died and the definitions of loyalty were stretched to breaking. Whether the signature belonged to the man he suspected or to someone skilled at imitation, Billy could not yet say, but the shape of a puppeteer's hand began to emerge, and with it the realization that whoever wanted Cain contained also wanted Lily implicated, Holden complicated, Amy destabilized, and both the Newmans and Abbotts sufficiently distracted that Arabesque's proposed governance structure could be slid across a table with minimal resistance, a structure whose bylaws hid a veto power. In definitions, a power that would, once codified, be almost impossible to unmake.